My father disappeared for 15 years and suddenly returned, claiming he deserves a share of my business. 15 years ago, my dad left home and never came back. No note, no explanation, just gone. I was 13, and my mum and I were blindsided. One day, he was sitting at the breakfast table, complaining about his coffee being too weak, and the next, his side of the closet was empty, and the family car was missing. It wasn't a dramatic blow-up or a messy divorce. It was silence, just nothing. Fast forward to last week. I'm 28 now, and life looks a lot different. I own a small bakery that I've poured my blood, sweat, and tears into. It's not a multi-million-dollar empire or anything, but it's my dream, and it's thriving. I have a solid routine, a few good friends, and even though I'm single, I'm genuinely happy. My mom lives nearby and we're close. Things are steady. I don't think about my dad much anymore, at least not in a way that hurts. Until last week, when he walked through the door of my bakery, like he'd just gotten back from the store. At first, I didn't even recognize him. The guy in front of me was older, grayer, and had this worn-out look like life had hit him hard. He stood there for a second, looking around like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Then he smiled, this weird, hesitant smile, and said, "Hey, kiddo." I froze. It was like my brain short-circuited. I think I stammered something like, "What? What are you doing here?" Because honestly, what the hell was I supposed to say? He acted like this was just some casual reunion. He started saying how proud he was of me, how he'd heard about my bakery, and how he always knew I had it in me. I felt my stomach twist. Proud? He knew I had it in me? This man hadn't spoken to me or my mom in 15 years. He didn't even send a birthday card. And now he was standing in my shop, acting like he just missed a couple of family dinners. Here's where it gets even crazier. After a few awkward minutes of small talk, mostly him rambling, about how time got away from him, he drops the bomb. He says he's back now, ready to reconnect. And wait for it. He thinks he deserves a piece of the pie since I'm doing so well. At first, I thought I misheard him. A piece of the pie? I asked him what he meant, and he had the audacity to explain that since I'm successful now, he's entitled to a share of my business because, get this, we're family and family sticks together. I couldn't even speak. I just stood there staring at him, trying to process the sheer nerve of this man, family sticking together. The same man who left me and my mom scrambling to pay rent. The man who didn't bother to check if we were okay when I had to drop out of volleyball because we couldn't afford the fees. The same man who ghosted his own family for more than a decade. I told him as calmly as I could manage that my success had nothing to do with him, that everything I built was because of my mom and me, that he didn't get to waltz back into my life and make demands. He didn't take that well. He started saying how I wouldn't even exist if it weren't for him, how I have his entrepreneurial spirit, because it runs in the family. I was so mad I could feel my hands shaking, but I held my ground. I told him to leave. Before he walked out, he said something that sent chills down my spine. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "You'll regret this. Blood is thicker than water," and then he left. Since then, I've been a mess of emotions, anger, confusion, even a weird kind of guilt. I don't owe him anything. I know that logically, but part of me can't stop wondering why now. Why after all this time did he come back? What does he really want? And here's the kicker. My mum didn't seem all that surprised when I told her. She got this strange look on her face, like she'd been waiting for this moment. She said, "There's more to your father's story than you know. We should talk." So now I'm sitting here, replaying that conversation over and over in my head, wondering what the hell is going on. Update. After my dad dropped that bombshell about wanting a share of my business, and then stormed out with his cryptic "blood is thicker than water" line, I couldn't stop obsessing over what my mum said. She said, "There's more to your father's story than you know. We should talk." What did she mean by that? For years, I assumed he left because he was selfish, irresponsible, or just didn't care about us. Now it felt like there was some big secret I'd been kept in the dark about. And honestly, I didn't know if I wanted to hear it. That night, I went to my mom's house determined to get answers. She was calm, too calm, and that made me even more anxious. We sat down at the kitchen table, and she took a deep breath before saying, "I never wanted to tell you this because I didn't want you to think less of him, but I think it's time you know the truth." Here's where it gets insane. My dad didn't just leave us. He left because he was in serious trouble. Turns out he'd been involved in some shady business. Deals back in the day, illegal stuff. Though my mom didn't know all the details, apparently. He got in over his head with some dangerous people, and leaving us was his way of protecting us. She said he told her, "If I stay, they'll come for me and for you." And just like that, he was gone. No goodbye, no promise to come back, nothing. I sat there, stunned. Protecting us by abandoning us? It didn't make sense. If he cared so much about our safety, why hadn't he checked in over the years? Why hadn't he sent even a letter to let us know he was alive? My mum admitted she hadn't heard from him since the day he left either. She had no idea where he went or what he'd been doing all this time. But here's where things get even weirder. After hearing this, I couldn't let it go. I needed to know what he'd been up to for the last 15 years. So I did something I never thought I'd do. I started digging into his life. I knew his name, his birthday, and a few details about his past. So I used those to do some online searches. At first, it felt like trying to find a needle in a haystack. The guy didn't even have a Facebook profile. But after hours of digging, I found something, a public records database, showing he'd lived in another state for most of the time he was gone. And then I found something that made my blood run cold. He wasn't just living in another state. He had another family, a wife and a son. My dad had started a whole new life like we never existed. I can't even describe what that felt like. Betrayal doesn't cover it. It was like I'd been erased while my mom and I were struggling to make ends meet. This man was playing house with a brand new family. I was furious, but I also couldn't stop digging. I needed to know everything. Why had he come back now? Was his new life falling apart? Did they even know about me and my mom? Over the next few days, I pieced together more details. His wife, let's call her Linda, had filed for bankruptcy about a year ago, and his son, who's 16, had been in some legal trouble. From what I could tell, their financial situation was a disaster. It all started to make sense. He didn't come back because he missed me. He came back because he needed money. I confronted my mom about all of this, and while she was shocked about the second family, she wasn't entirely surprised by the financial troubles. "Your father was always good at getting himself into a mess," she said, "but it's not your job to fix it." Still, I felt like I needed to hear it from him. So, against my better judgment, I called him. When he answered, I went straight to the point. "Why did you really come back? Was it because of me or because you're in trouble?" There was a long silence before he sighed and said, "I'm not in trouble, kiddo. I just wanted to make things right." I pressed him. I told him I knew about the bankruptcy, the legal issues, the whole second family. That's when he got defensive. He started yelling about how families should help each other and how I should be grateful to him for giving me life. When I said that didn't entitle him to my success, he got nasty. He said if I didn't help him, he'd find another way. That sent me over the edge. I told him he was a coward for abandoning us, and that he had no right to come back and demand anything. I hung up before he could respond. My hands were shaking, and I felt this overwhelming mix of anger and sadness. A part of me wanted to believe there was some sliver of good in him, but everything he'd done proved otherwise. Now I'm left wondering what finding another way means. Is he planning to sue me? Is he going to try and manipulate me into giving him what he wants? Or is this just another empty threat from a man who spent his whole life running away from responsibility? Either way, I'm not backing down. I built my life without him, and I won't let him tear it apart now. Final update. The more I dug, the worse it got. I found out he tried to list my bakery as an asset in a desperate attempt to secure a loan. And he didn't stop there. He forged documents claiming part of ownership of my business. Let that sink in. The man who abandoned me at 13 not only thought he could waltz back into my life, but he also thought he could steal what I'd worked so hard for. I was furious, but more than that, I felt violated. My business isn't just a job. It's my dream, my livelihood, my safe space, and he was trying to take it from me. I knew I couldn't let this slide. I needed to confront him, not just for me, but for the 13-year-old girl he left behind. I called him and told him to meet me at a diner halfway between our towns. He agreed, probably thinking I was ready to make amends or some other garbage he'd convinced himself of. When I walked into that diner, he was already there, sitting in a booth with his arms spread out like he owned the place. He smiled when he saw me, like this was some happy reunion. I didn't even sit down. I just pulled out a folder with all the evidence. I'd collected copies of the forged documents, proof of his failed loan attempts, and screenshots of his second wife's bankruptcy filings. I dropped it on the table and said, "Care to explain this?" His face changed so fast it was almost funny. He went from smug to shocked to angry in a matter of seconds. He tried to deny it at first, saying I didn't understand the situation, but I didn't let him get a word in. I told him I knew everything about the debts, the second family, and his pathetic attempt to use my bakery to bail himself out. I told him he was a coward for abandoning us and a fool for thinking I'd ever let him manipulate me. That's when he snapped. He started yelling about how I was ungrateful and how everything he'd done was for the family. He even tried to play the victim, saying he had no choice but to leave us because of his debts. like that was some noble sacrifice. I just stood there, letting him dig his own grave. When he finally ran out of steam, I said, "You don't get to call yourself my family. You gave that up 15 years ago." Then came the threats. He said he'd take me to court, that he'd fight for a share of my business because legally he's still my parent. But I had done my homework. I told him I'd already spoken to a lawyer and that he didn't have a leg to stand on. I also let him know that if he kept pushing, I'd report him for fraud and make sure everyone, including his new family, knew exactly who he was. The look on his face was priceless. For the first time, he realized he wasn't in control. He couldn't manipulate me, couldn't guilt me, couldn't threaten me. He was powerless. And honestly, it felt incredible. Before I left, I gave him one last piece of advice. I said, "You should be careful who you mess with. Not everyone is as forgiving as I've been." Then I walked out of that diner and didn't look back. Here's the wildest part. A few days later, I got a call from a mutual acquaintance. My dad had been arrested. Turns out I wasn't the only person he'd tried to con. One of his former business associates had filed charges against him for fraud, and the evidence I'd collected was enough to seal the deal. He's looking at serious time. I wish I could say I felt bad for him, but I don't. He made his choices, and now he's facing the consequences. For years I blamed myself for his leaving, thinking maybe I wasn't enough to make him stay. But now I see him for who he really is. A selfish, manipulative man who was never going to change. If there's one thing I've learned from all this, it's that family isn't about blood. It's about loyalty, love, and showing up when it matters. My mom showed up, my friends showed up. My dad, he chose to walk away, and I've finally made peace with that. The last thing I'll say is this. If someone ever tries to take advantage of you, don't be afraid to fight back. Stand your ground, protect what's yours, and don't let anyone, even family, take away what you've worked for. If you enjoyed this Reddit story and want to hear more, please make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more thrilling content. Your support means a lot. Thank you for being part of this journey.